Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for giving me this 1 hour and a half, as somebody pointed out, to say whatever I want. Because as you can see, there is no topic assigned to my name. I have the longest spot in the program. I was asked this morning to bring to you the perspective of the immigrant and refugee serving community on the recent changes to government funding and service delivery to newcomers to Canada, particularly refugees and other forced migrants. I would like to begin with the caveat that you might find little to be happy about in my presentation. But since it's the last day of the conference, I will try to leave you with at least some morsels of encouragement. In brief, the news in Ontario has not been good in the recent past. It is not good now, and we expect that it will not be much better in the future. The news for the rest of Canada, particularly the Western region, is probably less gloomy, even with the repatriation of the devolution immigration agreements. And for those of you not involved in our settlement programs here in Canada, unlike Ontario, both British Columbia and Manitoba had agreements with the federal government whereby they were able to administer settlement dollars that was transferred from the federal government to the provincial government. The economies of the West, from Manitoba to BC, continue to boom. Immigrant arrivals continue to increase. Provincial governments and civil society's commitment to refugee asylum and protection continue to be strong, and funding for settlement services and programs continue to grow. Not so here in Ontario. But let me tell you a bit about OCASI to put my remarks in context. OCASI is the umbrella organization for immigrant and refugee agencies in Ontario. The council was incorporated in 1978, around the same time as the Canadian Council for Refugees and other sector umbrella organizations in other provinces, with a few exceptions. At the risk of generalizing, I would like to think that OCASI, like all the provincial umbrellas, were founded with the goal of working towards the equitable settlement and integration of immigrants and refugees, and to act as a collective voice for their members. OCASI has worked towards this goal for more than 30 years, by building the capacity of our member agencies to effectively meet the settlement needs of their clients, and by undertaking public policy research and analysis to bring systemic change and improve access to opportunities. We also work to promote equity in all areas of the sector and in society as a whole, not only for refugees and immigrants, but for all marginalized individuals and communities. OCASI's capacity work has included seminars, workshops, and other training opportunities on issues such as working with survivors of trafficking, violence against women, LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex issues, understanding client mental health needs, and on the nuts and bolts of the sector's work, such as the refugee determination process in Canada, addressing the resettlement challenges of refugees, labor market integration, organizational capacity, and much more. As we all know, information is critical in the settlement and integration process of new Canadians. To meet their information needs, the Council developed the award-winning website settlement.org and the French language sister site establissement.org. The sites are the premier source of information for immigrants and for those who work with them. They are also a resource for individuals who work in refugee resettlement, as well as for those interested in privately sponsoring refugees through the Group of 5 sponsors. OCASI developed Settlement at Work as a resource for sector practitioners who work with immigrants and refugees. The site includes information developed by OCASI, such as our recently released joint report, The State of Immigrant and Refugee Women's Status in Canada, and resources from other stakeholders, such as the Refugee Mental Health Guide produced by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and links to many excellent public education materials published by Community Legal Education Ontario, such as the fact sheet, Being Arrested and Detained for Immigration Reasons. For more than 30 years, OCASI has advocated for equity and justice for immigrants and refugees. Every year, OCASI works with community organizations and other allies in Toronto to organize Refugee Rights Day to celebrate the landmark Singh decision of April 4th, 1985, when the Supreme Court of Canada found that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects the fundamental rights of refugees. To mark the day, this year, we organized public education activities to inform and educate the Canadian public on issues of refugee rights, including their settlement and integration in Canada. The committee organized a youth flash mob at Dundas Square, which is a public space in the heart of Toronto's business and shopping district, and a subway smart mob. For the smart mob, volunteers traveled the public transit system while holding large signs with messages about refugee rights. For the most part, the volunteers were met with encouragement from other transit users. And I think what was most compelling about this is that it was a silent protest, so that those on the subway trains did not feel intimidated or did not feel that this was message in your face. But by standing silently and holding up the signs, it actually encouraged folks to ask questions, and so to open up a dialogue about refugees. And the one thing I want you to pay attention to is the tagline for this initiative, don't turn back the clock, which I think has been very compelling, and it's certainly a message we have to continue to carry forward as we continue to fight the many changes that are happening in our determination system. But as I said, this kind of positive reaction is becoming all too rare, as we well know. It is a depressing fact that anti-refugee sentiment and immigrant bashing has been a growing reality in Canada. While the degree, source, and specific targets change from time to time, there continues to be a very vocal minority who continues to express very xenophobic remarks around immigration, immigrants, and asylum seekers. In this context, even the small-scale activities such as those organized for Refugee Rights Day are important and have a small but significant impact. As those of you here in Canada well know, advocacy or even public education is never easy. We have all experienced our share of pushback from government, from media, from groups like business organizations, and from members of the public. The most recent occurrence was during OCASI's and other allies' appearance before the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration Canada regarding Bill C-31. Peter Shaula, who is a colleague of ours, and he's director of the Refugee Forum, located at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, and the former chair of the Immigration and Refugee Board, has captured the experience of going before the Standing Committee this year most accurately in his op-ed last week in Embassy magazine titled "Making Sausages on the Hill, the Case of Bill C-31. We are led to wonder about the value about appearing before the Standing Committee when the environment is clearly hostile, where witness testimony that is critical of the government's position is met with disdain, and where committee members attempt to debate with witnesses as if we were in the House. Public education and advocacy on justice and fair treatment of refugees has never been more important in Canada as we face drastic changes to our refugee immigration system, changes that will have grave consequences for a large number of the most vulnerable people. In this context, the role that councils like OCASI can play in advocacy and public education is critically important, even as we see diminishing resources for this kind of work and a growing advocacy chill here in Canada. The federal government's discomfort with advocacy was demonstrated most clearly starting in 2006, when all of its $5.5 million funding to the Court Challenges program was cut. The program gave groups and individuals the resources to challenge federal government legislation, particularly on grounds related to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was an important resource for equity-seeking groups, including racialized communities, women, and LGBTI individuals and communities. The official languages minority component of the program was restored in 2008, and this continues to be the only aspect of the program that remains today. Around the same time, in 2006, the government cut funding to Status of Women Canada. This resulted in the closing of 12 out of the 16 of their offices across the country, and significant cuts were made to the funding of feminist women's organizations. It was the last nail in the coffin of our national feminist organization here in Canada, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. The government had earlier cancelled the National Child Care Program that had been negotiated with the provinces. Cuts to women's programs and women's focused initiatives continued over the next few years. The most recent victim to federal budget cuts is the Women's Health Contribution Program. The program allowed Health Canada to fund innovative interdisciplinary health research, build community partnerships, and provide important mentorship opportunities for students in women's health. The cuts are completely counter to the government's stated commitment to gender equality, expressed both here at home and internationally. Vulnerable groups such as refugee women and women facing multiple inequities were the hardest hit by the loss of women-focused initiatives. Organizations that provide services to refugees and immigrant women, racialized women, Aboriginal women, and women fleeing domestic violence were among those that lost all of their Status of Women funding. Some of these same organizations later lost all of their settlement funding from Citizenship and Immigration Canada, and this only aggravated the impact on the client communities that they work with. The Status of Women's mandate, and this is, I still can't believe this happened, the Status of Women's mandate was changed to exclude the term gender equality and political justice, and to ban all advocacy, policy research, and lobbying. Yet another clear demonstration of the advocacy chill that exists here. It is against this background that we must consider the impact of federal funding cuts to immigrant and refugee settlement. To fully understand the impact of the cuts, let's take a brief look at the close to recent history with immigrant and refugee settlement funding in Canada, excluding the Refugee Assistance Program, which I will speak about a bit later. Federal government funding for immigrant settlement services, including in Ontario, was flatlined for more than 10 years during the period of 1993 to 2005, a time of immigration growth in the country. It was the same funding situation across Canada, except for Quebec, which has a separate funding agreement with the federal government with an escalating funding formula. So the funding for settlement of immigrants and refugees in Quebec can only go up, it can never be reduced. Great agreement if you can get it, and one that government is loath to touch federally. During that period, Ontario received the highest number every year of immigrants and refugees who arrived in Canada. This has not changed despite a reduction in the rate of immigration to Ontario over the last few years. Ontario's share of permanent residents declined from almost 60% of all arrivals in 2001 to a little over 42% in 2010. Quebec had the next highest share in 2010 at a little over 19%. Ontario's share of refugees in all categories continues to be high at about 57%. This represents, for the province, 16% of all new arrivals to Ontario. The chronic underfunding of immigrant and refugee settlement for more than 10 years left Ontario sector agencies scrambling to fill the resource gap from other funders like provincial and municipal governments, foundations, and organizations like the United Way. But there was a diversity of experience even within this context. Small agencies faced the biggest challenge in trying to meet client needs while keeping their organizations afloat. Small agencies included those focused on particular ethno-specific community or community of common bonds, such as immigrant women's organizations. A significant number of ethno-specific agencies were funded by refugee communities, such as the Roma community, the Tibetans, Somalis, Ethiopians, and Tamils. Many smaller agencies were routinely overlooked for program funding by government funders, with funders usually citing concerns around their capacity to manage funds. Funding inadequacies impacted everything, from services to wages and organization infrastructure. There was limited funding available to serve the needs of those who did not qualify for Citizenship and Immigration Canada funded services, such as refugee claimants. Many agencies typically relied on provincial and other funding to address this gap. This remains an ongoing challenge for the sector. Meanwhile, provincial funding for immigrant settlement in Ontario was cut in 1995 and never fully restored, although the provincial government later increased funding slightly in response to the most recent round of federal government funding cuts last year. Federal government funding in 1995 to 2005 was insufficient to meet the needs of specific populations such as refugee women, youth, and seniors, and these needs went unmet for many years. A significant number of immigrant and refugee serving agencies were located in less than optimal physical space with shabby furnishing, poor lighting, poor air quality, and insufficient or inappropriate space, such as lack of private counseling space. So imagine having to address the counseling needs of your clients who have been tortured in very cramped spaces. Many did not have computers until 1977-98, when CIC, Ontario Region, funded the purchase and installation of computers and technical support for agencies funded to deliver their settlement services. Wages in the immigrant and refugee serving sector were among the lowest in the broader community and social service sector jobs. Like the rest of the broader sector, jobs in immigrant and refugee services were characterized by heavy workloads, lots of overtime, and uncertainty over continued employment due to funding issues. The existence of settlement services was also not widely known by new arrivals. At the same time, the large and growing number of immigrant and refugee arrivals produced increased service demands and the imperative to find a way to address the growing complexity of the services needed. To some extent, the complexities resulted from the changing face of the immigrant and refugee demographics. The new arrivals were predominantly racialized and from the global south, came with different needs and faced different systemic barriers in their settlement process. Other complexities arose from difficulties with labor market access and the disconnect between program imperatives and client needs. Shortly thereafter, the federal government negotiated an immigration agreement with Ontario for the first time. The agreement was signed in November 2005 and provided 5-year funding that would grow incrementally to a total of $920 million in investment. The funding increase is said to be the result of pressure from the Ontario government. A new Liberal government was elected in 2003 while we had a Liberal government at the national level, and where Ontario made an argument for a fair share, particularly in reference to the size and annual growth of Quebec's settlement funding grant. The increase in overall funding for the national program and the significant increase in funding for Ontario acknowledged the importance of settlement services for immigrants and refugees, acknowledged that the sector had been starved of resources for more than a decade, recognized that labor market integration was an important part of the settlement process, and acknowledged the historical trend in underfunding, particularly in real program delivery costs in areas such as overhead, program costs, and worker salaries. The new funds allowed for a number of innovations, program enhancements, and addressing unmet needs. The notable improvements included developing youth-specific programs, enhancement of language training, and investments in programs that support labor market access, such as bridge training for internationally trained refugees and immigrants. Another important innovation was the expansion of the service delivery model, including settlement workers in the schools and settlement workers in libraries. This program took service off-site by placing frontline workers in public service locations such as schools or libraries. The partnership with public institutions allowed settlement workers to provide information and referral services to all newcomers regardless of status in Canada, including refugee claimants. It became an important resource for individuals who were not eligible for federal government-funded services. Another significant impact was the tremendous growth and increase of professionalization of Ontario's immigrant and refugee serving sector. The number of agencies funded by Citizenship and Immigration Canada grew, and the number of funding agreements with CIC increased by 97% compared to the pre-agreement period. The funds allowed the entry of new players who were also new to the immigrant and refugee serving sector. Agencies already receiving funds expanded operations and increased their capacity. The change was reflected in the growth in OCASI's membership, which now stands at around 220 agencies across the province. Most importantly, the availability of funds allowed agencies to develop and expand collaborative relationships with other stakeholders and to look for creative ways to address the needs of underserved groups like refugee claimants. Agencies were also able to develop or expand capacity to provide equitable access to services, including services for those with disabilities and sexual minorities. The Canada-Ontario Immigration Agreement, COIA, formally recognized the role of municipalities in immigrant settlement for the first time. And what we saw coming out of that agreement was the creation of a new program called Local Immigration Partnerships. This initiative brings together a broad range of stakeholders with the goal of undertaking local planning for immigration. The creation of the new relationships and the strengthening of existing ones allowed some agencies, among other things, to expand and intensify efforts to work with underserved groups. The major amount of funding in the agreement was to be spent in year 5, the final year of the agreement. CIC was responsible for administering the agreement, specifically for the disbursement of the funding. At that time, however, Citizenship and Immigration Canada and the Provincial Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration did not have the administrative resources required to fully implement the agreement. CIC in particular was short of people to deal with the influx of new applications for funding. Implementation was further delayed by the extensive consultation that was undertaken to meet agreement requirements and by the implementation of new federal government financial accountability rules. A combination of these factors caused delays in rolling out the funding and led to the underspending of funds committed to the Canada-Ontario Immigration Agreement. This underspent money of over $200 million was never reinvested in Ontario, and it continues to be a point of contention between the provincial and federal governments. Sector agencies too had to scramble to strengthen administrative capacity to deal with increased funding and often multiple agreements with the federal government. While the funds were a welcome change that allowed agencies to finally begin to address long-time unmet client needs, they were sometimes hard-pressed to find the required expertise when hiring for the many new positions that were created. And what we have seen since 2005 is an increase of academic programs, particularly at the college level, that trains new workers to come into the immigrant and refugee serving sector through their social work and social services programs, which is a very welcome change. While much that is positive came out of the Canada-Ontario Immigration Agreement and its significant infusion of cash into the sector, it failed on one fundamental ground. This new partnership did not result in the changing of eligibility rules for clients' access to services. The opening up of eligibility for federally funded services is a key advocacy priority for the sector. This missed opportunity meant that agencies working solely with refugee claimants and migrants without full status in Canada were left out and continue to struggle to finance the important work that they do. In late August of 2010, the Provincial Minister of Immigration and OCASI, among others, were informed that the Department of Citizenship and Immigration had undertaken a strategic review intended to find efficiencies and thus reduce the department's budget. The review resulted in a 5% reduction to the settlement and integration funding envelope across Canada. This resulted in the national budget for Citizenship and Immigration Canada's Immigrant Settlement Services being cut by $53 million in 2011-2012. Ontario absorbed almost $44 million of that money, representing more than 80% of the cuts. British Columbia experienced the second highest cut of $8.5 million. The Ontario situation produced an all-party motion from the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration to reverse the cuts. The government ignored the vote. An additional $31.5 million was cut this fiscal year in 2012-13 in Ontario. The province was further disadvantaged by its inclusion for the first time in the national funding allocation model that ties funds to a per immigrant formula on a rolling 3-year arrival basis. Since the rate of permanent resident arrivals to Ontario has been dropping over the last few years, we will continue to see an equivalent drop in settlement funding for the province from the federal government. There has been some attempt to mitigate this downward funding trend in the province by the federal government, who now funds refugees at $2.50 for every $1 spent on immigrants. But before I continue with the funding cuts, let me turn my attention for a moment to the Resettlement Assistance Program, which is a standalone program in the area of settlement and funding. The federal government increased the allocation of the National Resettlement Assistance Program for 2012-13 by $1.9 million to a total of approximately $58 million. RAP, which is the assistance program, provides support for government-assisted refugees who are selected overseas and then brought to Canada. RAP investment is a fraction, about 10%, of the total settlement funding envelope, which is a little over $605 million nationally. In the 10-year period between 2001 and 2011, the total number of government-assisted refugees brought to Canada was cut from about 8,600 in 2001 to slightly over 7,200 in 2010. More importantly, GARs were 3.5% of all permanent resident arrivals in 2001, but only about 2.5% in 2010. Privately sponsored refugees increased from about 3,500 in 2001 to slightly over 4,800 in 2010. In March of 2010, the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration announced that the government-assisted refugees program would be expanded over time by 500, and the privately sponsored refugee program would expand by 2,000. In 2011, Canada received over 7,300 government-assisted refugees and over 5,500 privately sponsored refugees, showing an increase over the previous year in each of the categories. Sponsorship agreement holders have asked the government repeatedly to increase the limit on privately sponsored refugees, pointing out that Canadian sponsors and not the government will bear the cost of resettlement. So there is no economic barrier to having some private sponsors who continue to bring in as many people as the capacity will allow. While RAP funding has been more or less untouched compared to the settlement funding envelope, agencies working to resettle refugees have noted two critical challenges. In recent years, government-sponsored refugees have come predominantly from countries in the global south and are predominantly racialized, as I said earlier. Many have lived in protracted refugee situations with long-term impact on their ability to deal with the major changes involved in resettling in a new and a very different country. Canada has also shifted focus to resettling high-needs refugees, a welcome and highly commendable shift. Further, systemic barriers to labor market integration have negatively impacted the settlement path of not only refugees, but also of immigrants. Those who are racialized face the biggest challenges, as is evident in the high level of racialized and gendered poverty in Canada in general, and among refugees and immigrants in particular. Agencies assisting government-sponsored refugees have been grappling with the result of a combination of these factors, which ultimately lead to a delay in settlement for refugees. These challenges are further compounded by the requirement to almost immediately pay back the crippling transportation loans which the Government of Canada imposes on refugees, together with interest. The issue of transportation loans is one of the most cruel and ridiculous situations that our government has created in the name of helping to resettle refugees. The Canadian government is willing to resettle a refugee, but only if she promises to pay the cost, which is enormous for many individuals, but a very small amount for our government, of bringing her here. Clearly, most refugees are not in a situation to pay the money back right away or even over many years. Yet they receive a letter demanding repayment shortly after arrival and have to make arrangements to pay even if they're living on government assistance, which would be the same amount as our social assistance rates. And let me tell you, our social assistance rates in our provinces are not living wages. CIC's approach to implementing, so that's our codes. Those are good codes. Citizenship and Immigration Canada's approach to implementing the 2010 funding cuts in Ontario, particularly in Toronto, was unprecedented. A total of 47 agencies across the province lost 100% of their funding. Of that number, 13 are members of OCASI. Of those 13, 8 were located here in the city of Toronto. Almost 50% of the defunded agencies serve racialized communities, including new refugee arrivals. The cuts left lingering feelings of uncertainty and destabilization for some local areas of Ontario's immigrant and refugee serving sector, which is still in the process of dealing with the full effects. In September of last year, OCASI surveyed the 133 member agencies who received CIC funding, including the 13 agencies that lost all of their funding, to learn more about the impact of the cuts. CIC funds other agencies that are not OCASI members, and these contracts too were cut fully or partially. The response rate was fairly high at 67% of the agencies surveyed, representing 90 agencies. The majority of the respondents received partial or full funding cuts, and a very small minority received a funding increase. Almost 50% of the cuts were to Toronto agencies, the region with the largest population of immigrants and refugees. The cuts impact agencies differently based on what portion of the budget was represented by CIC funding. So it makes sense then that agencies that were solely dependent on CIC funding were the hardest hit. As a result of the cuts, some agencies had to relocate to smaller space. A significant number of agencies reported an increase in the administrative burden due to the cuts, as well as increased scrutiny by CIC funding officers. Some agencies recounted instances of intrusive monitoring behavior by some CIC officers in the wake of the cuts, while others received a very sympathetic hearing. 78% of agencies who responded to the survey reported losing staff positions as a result of the cuts. A total of 169 full-time equivalents were lost. Given the survey response rate, it is likely that the actual number of jobs lost in the sector is much higher. CIC, however, does not cover costs associated with terminating an employee. So more than half of the agencies reported extreme or moderate difficulty in meeting these costs. And these are costs of severance for employees who had worked with the organizations for, at times, over 2 decades, vacation time that was owed, and those kinds of costs that employers are responsible for. The loss of jobs, of course, impacted the services that agencies could provide. 39% of respondents said that they were serving fewer clients. More than half reported that they were serving the same number of clients with less money. Anecdotal reports from frontline practitioners outside of the survey show an increase in workload reminiscent of the pre-COIA days of underfunding. Where agencies had some control over how the cuts were applied, they made efforts to reduce the impact on clients. This meant that staff burden was increased in agencies that lost jobs, with workers doing more work in the same amount of time. Many respondents described a significant increase in stress, uncertainty, and fear about the future and the mental and physical impacts of the stress. Despite agencies' best efforts, the increased workload carries with it the risk of deteriorating service quality. The cuts also force those organizations that found a way to serve clients, such as refugee claimants and those without full status, to reduce and in some cases to eliminate these services. So of course this reduction in services by the federally funded agencies meant a downloading on the few organizations that work with refugee claimants and those without status, forcing them to further stretch their scarce dollars in an attempt to meet the growing needs of the numbers of clients requiring services. So here in the sector, we have a number of organizations who are funded by the federal government. They lose their funding. have to let go of staff, have to decrease their capacity, and the few organizations who had never received government funding, who work with people without full status, who work with refugee claimants, are now having to figure out a way to pick up that workload with very few dollars. And that continues to be a concern across the province. A number of our respondents expressed concern that marginalized client populations, including seniors, isolated women, clients with disabilities, and others were more negatively affected by the cuts. Providing services to these groups is generally more costly in terms of time and resources, and so a reduction in capacity meant fewer services existed for these particular groups. Respondents also reported on the loss of the sector of many highly qualified and experienced staff. They noted that the uncertain funding situation and a lack of job security are barriers in attracting capable workers to the sector. Some survey respondents expressed fear of speaking out on issues of client access and equity for immigrants and refugees, which had been a routine part of the work before the cuts. The issue of the advocacy chill and fear of losing charitable status has come to dominate sector conversations in the wake of the cuts. The cuts had a demoralizing and destabilizing effect on the sector. The Ontario government stepped up to address some of the funding shortfall by giving a 5% increase to the provincial funding envelope for immigrant and refugee settlement. The United Way of Greater Toronto provided resources and collaborated with OCASI to support agencies that lost all CIC funding to deal with the issues of transitioning their operations. However, these interventions are a drop in the bucket viewed against the full scope of the cuts. Further funding cuts will have serious consequences for the sector's continued stability and ability to effectively meet the settlement and integration needs of immigrants and refugees. They have already begun to have an impact in the cutting back of innovative measures to meet the needs of vulnerable and underserved populations. These individuals and groups will increasingly have to compete with each other for an ever-shrinking pool of resources. I received a phone call yesterday from the researcher for People for Education, which is an advocacy and research think tank here in Ontario. And their latest report, which will be released next week, shows that 40% of immigrant families in our elementary public institutions, schools, have no access to settlement services. These are the kinds of innovative programming that we were able to do with the increase in funding that we're now experiencing being eroded. When there's an increasing need for those kinds of services for families who are coming in, particularly families who are relocated in smaller city centers. In a period when the provincial government, municipalities, and foundations like the United Way are facing fiscal challenges themselves, the federal government's slow withdrawal of support for Ontario's immigrant and refugee serving sector will have serious long-term consequences. But I did say I will not leave you with only bad news. So, Canada is unique in the world in our approach to refugee resettlement and immigrant settlement. Originally, settlement referred to the establishment of new communities in which the process typically displaced and dislocated Canada's first peoples who were already living here. Until World War II, there was no recognition of the need to offer protection to those fleeing persecution. The early movements of asylum seekers were characterized as migrants, even though the individuals were clearly fleeing persecution and violence, including refugees of African descent who fought with the British in the War of 1812 against the Americans and had to flee to Canada as loyalists to those fleeing slavery between 1840 and 1860 who arrived in Canada via the Underground Railroad, a bit of Black Canadian history for you. Doukhobors, who were originally from Russia and were fleeing religious persecution, were also some of our early asylum seekers. Mennonites, who came to Canada from the US and from Russia, also fleeing religious persecution, as well as related economic oppression. There were no formal settlement services for these refugees. They often relied on each other. Some faced discrimination. In parts of Nova Scotia, Black refugees who arrived in Canada as loyalists were segregated into areas that had the poorest soil and were often denied economic and education opportunities that were available to other residents in the region. The federal government started off with providing direct services to immigrants and some refugees. Over time, the federal government shifted its involvement by entering into third-party funding arrangements with community organizations. While locating services in the communities was a positive, the government retained complete control over program design and delivery, with the imperative of making more services available with fewer resources. Being the largest funder, the federal government has had a huge impact on service design, as well as the development, structure, and shape of Canada's immigrant and refugee serving sector. The fact that many agencies feel compelled to structure themselves and limit their activities according to federal decision-makers' narrow definitions of the role of NGO is a cause for alarm. The government continues to impose and retain this influence through funding requirements and implied sanctions, such as the withholding or withdrawing of charitable status for community agencies. Looking ahead to the impact of proposed refugee legislation that is currently moving through Parliament at lightning speed, and the impact of the many regulatory changes that have already begun to affect refugees and immigrants, we need to consider how our collective role as a sector, as agencies and as individuals, can make a difference to uphold our humanitarian values, as well as our track record for appropriate, effective, and equitable services. The recent funding cuts acted as a massive wake-up call for the sector. It woke us up to the dangers of becoming too dependent on one funder and for the need to diversify funding sources. I wish I could say that we have found a way out of this dilemma, but the reality is that in the current funding and economic climate, things are most likely going to get worse before they get better. But we do believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, because I don't think all is doom and gloom. What is promising is that the sector has spent many years working in partnership with communities to build their policy and advocacy, and this is now bearing fruit. We see it in the diversity of voices that are speaking out against the draconian measures proposed in Bill C-31. We witness the allies who for the first time are not only supporting progressive movement on refugee and immigrants issues, but are emerging as leaders in pushing back against changes that speak against the values we hold dear as Canadians. We have witnessed faith communities speaking truth to power, the medical doctors' alliances coming together nationally to inform the debate and to speak to the very real impact of bad public policy on real people's lives. We are witnesses to the strengthening of immigrant and refugee communities themselves, sharing their stories and asking that their rights be recognized and protected. I believe we can be optimistic as we move forward. Optimistic as we move forward, that Canadians with enough information and with the right kind of information will always come down on the side of compassion and justice. Thank you for sitting through that very long speech.